Welcome to the Spirit of Business episode number 49, Dealing with Confrontation with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum.
Hi Sarah.
Hi Matt.
I had a situation today that I'd like to talk about, and I feel like it's something that happened multiple times to me before, and I play with the different responses or the different ways of dealing with it. So it's very much around the word confrontation and having difficult or confronting conversations with people. I naturally, as a person, don't like confrontation, and so therefore I will typically avoid it. But as I've gotten, I suppose, more experienced in the world, I'm able to actually deal with it in a more comfortable way. Okay, so where I feel more grounded and I feel more centered around, and almost like, when you feel confident about something, you're in sort of a slow motion. You actually know exactly what you're doing, and you're going through the motions of it, and you're being very articulate with the way that you're operating. And now I feel I'm better at doing it rather than being uptight, emotional, anxious about it. I feel more grounded about it, but still find it quite difficult and don't really enjoy it. And then I start to look at it and go, what is that? What is confrontation? And what are we so annoyed about or get so emotional about when we're dealing with a confrontation? So I started to break down the word confrontation from the perspective of saying, what is it? Why do we avoid it? How can we get better at it? How can it just be a thing without it evolving so much emotion? So I'd like to talk a little bit about that today.
Just my favourite topic. I'm so good at confrontation. Ha ha. I also don't like it, and I have sometimes had to have those difficult conversations, and it feels to me like it's part of growing up to be able to do that and not to avoid it, and also not to do what many people do, who think that they like confrontation and they just shout at somebody or they just kind of blast off whatever it is, so they get their own satisfaction by expressing their anger or frustration. But I don't think that that's really dealing with confrontation. That's just releasing your own stuff. So to how to do that in a way that is responsible and respectful to the various parties that are involved, to me that's very much a part of being an adult and also being a business owner.
Actually, what you just said then was really interesting, is that how there's always two types of people or two types of way that people respond. And some people will say, I don't like confrontation. Other people say, I love confrontation. I thrive on confrontation. But it's interesting what you just said then about the people that may be in the classification of thriving on it, that look for it. They just see it as it is a way of getting their own enjoyment from yelling at somebody or acting in a particular way where they feel better about themselves because they do that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're better at it than somebody else that doesn't like confrontation. And I think this is the point that I'm really talking about today, is that whether you like it or you don't like it, as you say, there's probably a responsibility around it. And look, being a business owner for the last 30 years of my life, you live in an environment where you're always having what I classify as difficult conversations, which generally have some sort of a confrontational aspect to them. So as much as we may not like it, we have to do it every day of our lives in some form or another. And so it's a question of how we think about it and how we get better at it to ensure that it doesn't impact upon our health and well-being, because it typically goes towards stress, I think.
Yeah, and also you often need to get an outcome, but you want to do that in a way, it's not about destroying somebody else's health and well-being either. It's like there are two or more people involved wherever there's some confrontation, and if we think about it in a civilized way, you want to deal with the issue and not in the process destroy either yourself or somebody else in terms of the person. It's rather like with young children. You can tell a child that they're bad, or you can say this behavior wasn't good. There's a very, very big difference between dealing with just the behavior or just the issue and letting all of that spread out into your sense of who you are as a person, or who the other is. And I think that's quite challenging, actually, because often when there's confrontation, there's judgment sitting behind it. Somebody's feeling let down, or um, somebody's feeling put upon or manipulated, or so there are very strong words that can come up where people don't agree with each other.
It's interesting, I love to look at definitions of words. So I just thought I'd look at a definition of the word confrontation. And one of them says a hostile or argumentative situation or meeting between two opposing parties, a situation where two players or sides compete to win a sporting contest. So it's interesting, even the language that they use to describe the word confrontation is actually quite strong in its sense. It's almost aggressive in the way that you're describing it. And I think that that's maybe why we feel the way that we do, is it automatically heightens that, oh, actually, I'm in confrontation now. And so our natural responses of cortisol increases or adrenaline increases because we feel a bit threatened by the opposing party or the hostile or argumentative situation, as it sort of says. And I think that maybe there's something in identifying that part of it when we're in the moment of it.
And recognizing, if you think of the other analogy, which was about sport and competition, which is about one person winning and the other person losing, or one team winning and one team losing. And I think the challenging thing around confronting situations in business is often that there may be an outcome that's needed for the business. So let's say in your situation, you're in charge and you might have a confronting situation with somebody else who's on your team, and there's an outcome that needs to be achieved for the sake of the business and the bigger whole. But if it's done in the sense of, so I'm going to win over you, you actually leave a trail of negativity behind you. So this is like asking us to come up with solutions. That's why I use the word respect, because it feels to me like there are ways of coming to solutions that bring people on board, and there are ways of coming to solutions, and one of them is to impose your will over somebody else's, because that has to be done. Now, the outcome on the surface might be the same, that what you see needs to be done is done because you're the boss, maybe. But how it's done, it seems to me, there's a huge difference in how it's done, and that really matters.
I agree. I want to sort of talk about why confrontation occurs in the first place, to see if there's something in that. Because what you're talking about then is to say, okay, well, you've got opposing forces. Why do you have opposing forces in the first place? Because people have a difference of opinion, or they have a difference because of the fact that they see the world differently from the perspective of fairness. Because a lot of things in business I see have this concept around being fair. And we know that that's also a difficult concept to get our heads around a lot of the time, because people see fairness differently as well. But it's always around this, well, I think one thing based on all these parameters, and I think another thing based on all these parameters, and so therefore we're opposing. Okay, so we have opposing opinions, and that's where the confrontation starts. And so is the formula or the way that we're trying to get to that, rather than a positive or negative situation that arises as a result, we talk about, win-win or any of those sorts of, concepts. Are we sort of looking at it to say, is one person trying to explain to the other person why their point of view is actually right and the other person's wrong?
Usually.
And their point of view, your point of view about fairness is different to the other person, or actually you said one thing and you lied about it the second time around. Like, there's a whole lot of this sort of type thing that goes on. And for me, it seems to come back to this concept of what's fair and reasonable. And it's almost like what, a Westminster system around, legal. It's about what the reasonable person would suggest in that particular circumstance. And so this is where it starts to really blow my head apart, because in a lot of the situations in business, especially, the way that I always deal with it, and this is kind of the empathy aspect of it, I always put myself in the other person's shoes to see if I can understand why they think the way that they do, if they're opposing to think the way that I think. And I spend probably too much of my time trying to work that out, and to my own detriment. But this is where I start to get into this whole thing about, at the end of the day, it's not fair sometimes that people act the way that they do, and therefore you end up in this confrontation. And no matter what you do, there's going to be a disappointment around it. And so, when you go into a confrontational scenario, you think, well, you know what, this is actually not going to do anyone any benefit by me being part of it, because I cannot convince that other person that they're being unreasonable or unfair in the way that they're thinking about the world, and they're doing it maybe for a selfish means or self-centered means, or and look, I'm probably getting a bit emotional about it because I do deal with this on a day-to-day basis, and it becomes very fatiguing and very stressful, to stay in this space constantly, where it builds up this stressful emotion.
I did a course once and there was something that really stuck in my mind. I've never forgotten. I think it was really valuable. One part of the course was teaching us about the levels of development of human beings, and all human beings go through these certain levels in the same order, as do all cultures, interestingly. And we start as a baby and everything's pretty incoherent as a baby and kind of pretty much merged into a single experience, and then we emerge through these various stages. The thing that struck me was that the person who was teaching it said that conflict, so not confrontation but conflict, happens between stages. It's like different stages don't speak to each other because they have a different lens on life. And so conflict isn't really produced by the situation, it's produced by the lens through which a person approaches life. And one of the things that I realized from that is that if your lens is more expanded than somebody else's, and generally speaking, if you have a reasonably well-developed business owner, it may well be that their lens is more expanded because they're used to having to think of the whole rather than just the parts. They're used to having to look at future and present and past. There's a lot of different contexts that you operate in all the time. You may have a lens on any situation that somebody else can't see through. So you can see through their lens because you've been through that stage of development and that type of lens. There's like a type, but they actually can't see through yours. And I've had many situations in my life where it just felt so unfair. Like I had it often as a woman. How come I'm always the one who has to understand and be kind and be loving, or whatever it is that all seemed in that moment to be the more feminine characteristics, while you are allowed to do whatever you want or say whatever you want or behave however you want. But I'm the one who has to step up, be wise, be whatever it is. And I think it's rather like that. As a business owner, you're called again and again and again to be the one who does understand and who is able to draw the line where it needs to be drawn, and at the same time does it in a way that is respectful and as kind as you can, and all of those things. And the only thing I can say to that is that it's better having that bigger lens than it is having the smaller one, and that perhaps that's part of that's part of leadership. And it's by doing that over and over, and in the end not getting so fatigued by it, but actually holding it, that grows your capacity.
There's some comfort in what you're talking about there around the word evolution, is that because of our experiences of being business owners and having to deal with lots and lots of different things and situations constantly, we become probably more conscious and more evolved. Typically, I'm not saying all people do that, but typically if you're exposed to lots of different things all the time, you become more aware. And when you become more aware, you're able to probably sense other people's situations. And as I said, putting yourself in their shoes because you might have been there once upon a time from that experience. But what you're saying is that there's some comfort around the fact that it's okay that we do find ourselves in these situations. And because we do, we are more evolved. And so take some comfort and credibility and validation from that, to know that, okay, you're not the person that's really going mad or, stressed from this particular scenario, or that you're wrong in the way you're thinking, sort of type thing. But there's some comfort in the fact that you're saying, you know what, maybe you are more evolved, maybe you are right because you've experienced a lot more things. Not saying you're a better person, but you just experienced more things and been more evolved from this situation that you can look at it all and then help to educate somebody else about why you think the way you do. And if you're unsuccessful in that situation, we will wear that sometimes as maybe I failed at that particular confrontational circumstances and I ended up having to compromise too much because that's kind of the word that we end up being in a confrontational situation. There's always a compromise that goes on, and sometimes that compromise can feel good, but a lot of the time it doesn't feel great. And so when you do compromise, if you feel like that you're still getting that comfort because there's a bigger picture and a bigger element that you're trying to be a part of, rather than getting caught in a smaller bit, that can give you some sort of comfort in knowing that okay, well, that wasn't so great, but in the whole scheme of things, um, you know, I know that I'm still doing the right thing and moving in the right, more evolved, conscious direction.
I can think of one or two big conversations, big difficult conversations that I've had, and looking back on them, I've thought, did I need to have that conversation? Am I glad that I had it? Because sometimes I know that people have been hurt by things that I've said, which I needed to say at the time. And it's really interesting looking back at it because, in one way, I could say maybe I didn't need to do that. Maybe I was het up in my own picture of what was going on and I wasn't managing myself so well. And on the other hand, I'm really glad that I had that conversation because somehow it made our relationship more resilient and it actually did some good, even if I was clumsy. And this is one of the things that I've come to gradually is to realize that it's not about getting it right. That sometimes we're in that kind of situation and we need to deal with it the best we can, and we can look back on it and say, well, in a way it was good and in a way it was bad, and that's fine. That there isn't a perfect way to do it that I'm trying to aspire to. This is part of the day-to-day unfolding of life and situations, and we need to be able to respond rather than get it right. So sometimes I think we put pressure on ourselves because we think like, oh, I should be handling these kinds of situations in that kind of way. But where's that should coming from? And who says? And could you even? And isn't it perhaps just about the fact that you're in this situation, the other person's here, and you're kind of somewhat bumbling around some of the time, just trying to find your way through it and out to the other side. And life is a bit more real than these perfect scenarios we have.
It's a good point that you made because it made me reflect upon, circumstances too, where I might be in that situation where you might have said something because you have to have that conversation. And you've got two choices in that moment. You either have the conversation or you don't.
Yeah.
Okay. And probably historically, when I was younger, I wouldn't have the conversation. I would say if somebody was aggressive or confrontational or that sort of stuff, I'd probably just move on from it. Nowadays, I actually call it out and go, hang on a minute, what's this about? Can you explain to me why you're actually behaving this particular way in this situation? Because I just want to understand it. So I feel a lot more confident, a lot more grounded now. And this is what I was talking about, that slow motion, where the slow motion part of it is that I could quite easily not have the conversation, which means that you're not in that slow motion mode. You're still caught up in the he said, she said, or back and forth. Or I can sort of just cause that pause where I say, hang on a minute, what's actually happening here? Why is this occurring? What's going on? Why is this happening? And that I find there's a bit of power in actually calling out. And it's almost like you're calling a time out of the situation to stand back from the two people that are involved in it, or the people involved, and saying, look at us. What's actually happening here? Why are we doing this? What's the thing that's causing this ill feeling between us? And actually acknowledging that there is tension. I find that feels to me a good way that I've started to deal with this better. Whereas in the past, I just let the fire happen and the to and fro, and you end up getting a bit fiery, pulling yourselves out of the situation, looking at it as two people, spectators almost around, looking at the two people involved, saying, what is actually happening here?
I
Does
think
that make any
that's
sense? I'm trying to
absolutely.
explain what.
I love
Yeah.
your description of the slow motion. It's such a good description. It feels to me like that's where you start to really get conscious. You start to make choices about how you behave rather than just reacting to what's going on or surviving what's going on until you can get out of it. You actually start to choose. And just by that very action of choosing in that moment to say something different from what you would have said, which might have been just walking away or might have been being a part of it all, but just by making that choice you actually change the tone. And it's where you start to bring in some more perspective, which you described. And once there's perspective and you can look down on it, then interestingly, if you think about the levels we were talking about earlier, in a way you're now operating at two levels. You're operating at the level of being in the confrontation, and you're also at the level of being able to look at it, which is a more expanded
Mm.
level. I never thought about it that way. And the very fact that you can do that is really remarkable if you think about it, that human beings can be in something and also look at it at the same time. It's an amazing capacity that we have. But being able to rise above it actually takes you to a more expanded level. And once you can be there, that helps to start to dissolve some of the conflict.
Yeah, I think the word expanded really makes sense, and I do sort of, when you're talking, reflect upon my analogy around being on the pitch and then also being the spectator watching what's going on, sort of thing. So I'm in the confrontation, which is the battle or the sporting field, so to speak, and that analogy. But I'm also sitting in the stands going, let's analyze this for a second,
Being a
as the
commentator.
commentator. Exactly. And there's, I feel that expanded power in being the commentator, because it gives you the ability to stand back and really, and but not just you do it, but I found there's a lot of power in just calling out the other person. It's like, actually, let's both be the spectator. Let's both be the commentator on this, and let's analyze what we're actually doing here. And so you're actually forcing the other person to be expanded too, to take a different view of it as well, which completely changes, I think, the dynamic, as you say, as to what's going on actually on the field. Because when you go back on the field again, you're going, oh, I've got people watching me. I better actually act a different way.
Do you ever have situations where the other person can't do that? They're so locked into their perception that they can't step out?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
because the emotion, they can't separate the emotional aspect. Usually they get caught up so much in the emotion of the adrenaline's pumping and the cortisol's pumping and all that sort of type stuff in their body, that that they can't let go, and they have to be still, and they're in the battle still, and that's where it becomes difficult. And I suppose once again you've got the choice then, is to walk away at that point in time, because you know that you're not going to get. It's like a child. I was always taught as a parent, in one of the parenting lessons that I would have had at some point in time, by a child expert, saying, never confront a child in the heat of the moment or when they're having a tantrum. And it makes a lot of sense. And so wait, deal with what you have to deal with, and try and reduce the behavior down to something that's acceptable, and then have the conversation when the child is a lot calmer. I apply the same principle a lot in business when I can see that somebody else is having a tantrum, for want of a better word, and it's best just to calm them down and then walk away and then have the conversation later on.
Yeah, I mean, I learned that a long time ago in my work, that there is no point when somebody's reacting to something very emotionally, they're not capable actually of taking on really anything. They're completely in their own response, and you have to let that go. There's something coming out. They're releasing something or whatever. You have to let that go and wait until they have the ability to actually look at what's happening. So,
Mm.
yeah.
And so, the things that I've sort of feel comfortable or feel better about this is that we can have these conversations, feel more evolved in the fact that we've got a greater lens on us than maybe other people have had, because we've experienced more as business owners, but then also have the technique of calling out the behavior as to what you're seeing as a commentator to the situation, to see if the other person can recognize it, And maybe that's the point. If the other person can't recognize the behavior being not appropriate in terms of the confrontational aspect of it, then maybe that's a choice of when you actually walk away from it and come back and try again another day or another time, if you've got the luxury of being able to do that.
And sometimes you may have to be very patient with some people, I guess.
So yeah, it's interesting because even just by having this conversation, I feel better about some of the recent confrontations or conversations I've had to have with people that are quite difficult and awkward and uncomfortable. And I've managed them, but there's still this residue that sits with me. And I might have managed it in that particular way, but I still feel like I carry some of the emotion with it afterwards, even though I might have felt like I did a good job at the time. There's still sometimes you can get a little bit angry still and go, well, it's still annoying that I had to actually be, it's like what you said before, like it's annoying that you have to be that bigger person, or, in terms of, being a woman and having to be the one that's always doing the right thing. Sometimes there's this element where you want to be a child and go, you know what? I'm just tired of actually being a better person all the time.
I want to be behaved. There's one thing I just really want to pick up that you talked about a little bit earlier and is coming up here again as well. And that is when I think we get confused, because we know that as human beings we're equal. But at the same time, sometimes you can see or you suspect that your perspective is bigger than the other person's. But you know that you're also a bit riled by it, and then you make yourself wrong. And I think it's really easy for business owners to do this, and leaders, is to make themselves wrong. The other person's not behaving well. That's pretty clear. And it gets under your skin a little bit, which you would prefer it didn't, but it has for whatever reason. But it compounds things a lot if you then make yourself wrong and then try somehow to make yourself equal with the other person at the behavior level. So we can be equal as human beings, and you as the business owner can be the one who has a bigger, clearer perspective on the situation than the other person. Now, how we do that is a bit of an art, to really recognize the equality between us as humans, and at the same time there is an inequality between us at a certain level as maybe the owner and the employee. And sometimes what the owner says will have to go. It will have to be what prevails. That's a real art, and I think a big art for us as human beings. How to help somebody always feel that they're fully present as a human being with you, even if you're in a situation where you are actually going to win this fight, and that's the right outcome.
Yeah, and without getting caught up in ego as well, to think that because there's also a risk to think that if you're always the bigger person or the better person, maybe get caught up in that too, and there's an arrogance associated with it too that you have to keep yourself in check on as well, that you may not necessarily be that person.
And they may be able to see something that you can't see. And how many times has that happened where, I don't know if it happens to you, but to me, I weigh in. It's like, I think I can see everything that's going on. And somebody just says a sentence, a little thing. It's like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that. Yeah, I get it. All right, I'm sorry. So
therefore, there needs to be another element to this, which is also remaining open, that you may not necessarily know everything about this particular situation that you're addressing.
And at some level, of course, you always don't know everything. But we have to decide how far to go with that.
Exactly. So it's tricky.
The art of human relationships. We better leave it at that, I think.
I don't think we're going to sort that out in a podcast. But anyway, hopefully what this has done today is it just keeps you, I suppose, in the moment with having to deal with the difficulty that we deal with, and knowing that there's some comfort in knowing that we all have to address and face this sort of type stuff as well on a day-to-day basis. I like to normalize things and go, well, this is just part of what we have to do, and this is a way to think about it to give an opportunity to feel a bit better about it.
Yeah, well, that's pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to The Spirit of Business with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum. We'll be back next week with another episode. You'll find the show notes with links and other useful information on our website, spiritofbusiness.live. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends.